There's some things I really can't stand.
Like what?
Well, I don't like rap because the voice is always the same.
Morrissey has never been one to play nice, especially when it comes to music. While most artists go out of their way to avoid conflict, to smile politely in interviews and say vague things like, "Everyone brings something unique to the table," Morrissey took the table and flipped it over. Even at 66, he continues to be a cultural force not only because of his music, but because of his unapologetic and often brutal honesty. The man doesn't just share opinions, he launches verbal missiles, and if a few reputations get scorched in the process, so be it. Over the years, he's targeted some of the biggest names in pop, rock, and everything in between. These weren't harmless jabs or off-the-cuff jokes. No, Morrissey's takedowns were often philosophical, cutting to the very soul of what he considered true art and soulless industry. Whether you agree with him or think he's just a professional hater, one thing is certain: Morrissey's rants have created some of the most unforgettable feuds in music history. And today, we're diving into the 6 bands he couldn't stand. The ones that pushed every one of his buttons. From glitzy pop duos to global icons, these are the acts that Morrissey publicly skewered in a way only he could. Buckle up, this is about to get messy. Let's start with one of the most iconic synth-pop bands of the 80s. Duran Duran, to many, they were the face of British cool, beautiful, fashionable, with catchy hooks and cinematic music videos. But to Morrissey, they were the embodiment of everything wrong with music. The hatred ran deep, and it was never subtle. He once infamously referred to them as the acceptable face of fascism, a line so bizarrely poetic that it managed to confuse and offend at the same time. In his eyes, Duran Duran musicians, they were mannequins in expensive suits lip-syncing on yachts. While they were filming glossy videos in Sri Lanka with champagne and supermodels, Morrissey was writing about alienation, poverty, and the unbearable weight of being alive. They were bubblegum, he was broken glass. And he didn't hide that contempt. At one point, he even said that Duran Duran's success made him physically ill. For Morrissey, the worst crime an artist could commit was prioritizing image over authenticity. And Duran Duran represented that crime in neon lights. Ironically, both the Smiths and Duran Duran found massive success during the same era, but instead of creating mutual respect, it birthed bitter disdain. Even decades later, critics have looked back and noted that Duran Duran may have been more about brand than brilliance, but back then, it was pure war. And Morrissey was never afraid to fight dirty, but if you thought Duran Duran got it bad, wait until we get to Wham! Oh yes, Morrissey had absolutely no patience for George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley. To be fair, Wham! Stood for everything Morrissey detested: bright colors, commercial appeal, and pure, unfiltered happiness. Songs like Wake Me Up Before You Go Go might have made the world dance, but they made Morrissey want to run for the hills. He once said that Wham! Was the most ridiculous pop group he'd ever seen and that their music was an insult to intelligence. That's not a dig, that's a declaration of war. He couldn't fathom how anyone over the age of 12 could take them seriously. In fact, he went as far as saying that Wham! Represented everything wrong with modern Britain, that the country's obsession with cheerful, surface-level entertainment was a sign of cultural decay. It wasn't just about music, it was about national identity. While Wham! Were doing choreographed dances in short shorts, Morrissey was burying daffodils in his back pocket and singing about the crushing dread of everyday life. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. What makes this feud even more interesting is that both Morrissey and George Michael were, underneath all the theatrics, deeply talented artists. But Morrissey simply couldn't look past Wham's sparkle to see any substance, and honestly he never tried. The more successful they became, the more annoyed he seemed. It was as if joy itself offended him. Now let's talk about Madonna. This one isn't just a casual insult. This is one of the most intense, long-running feuds Morrissey has ever had. When Madonna was dominating the world stage, Morrissey wasn't impressed. In fact, he was outraged. He once referred to her as the closest thing to organized prostitution in the music industry. That's not just a criticism, that's character assassination. According to him, Madonna was a corporate creation, a master of image manipulation, who relied more on spectacle and sex appeal than on actual talent. He was especially critical of her during the Like a Prayer era, when she leaned hard into controversy with religious imagery and provocative performances. Morrissey dismissed it all as empty attention-seeking. He wasn't buying the narrative that she was pushing boundaries. He believed she was selling controversy like candy, packaging rebellion for profit. And when she adopted new accents, new religions, or new social causes, Morrissey mocked her as a chameleon who stood for nothing. But the feud got personal when he commented on her love life, suggesting that she used relationships as marketing strategies. To Morrissey, Madonna was less of an artist and more of a product, the perfect symbol of a music industry that prioritized fame over depth. What's fascinating, though, is how similar they really were in some ways. Both were fiercely independent, both polarizing, and both obsessed with control. But where Madonna used those qualities to become a global icon, Morrissey wielded them like a sword to strike down those he saw as fake. In his world, Madonna wasn't just a pop star. She was a threat to everything real. One of the more surprising targets of Morrissey's wrath was Radiohead. Yes, Radiohead, the band that critics have worshipped for decades, the band known for experimental genius and emotional depth. But Morrissey wasn't buying it. While he never launched a full-scale public feud like he did with others, he often made snide remarks that painted a very clear picture. He found them dreadfully boring. He once said that Radiohead were soulless and that listening to them was like watching rain dry. It's a line that stings because it's so smug and yet so undeniably Morrissey. He seemed to believe that their pretentiousness, their obsession with soundscapes and abstraction was just another kind of fakery. In his view, pain and sadness weren't supposed to be wrapped in layers of digital noise and cryptic lyrics. They were meant to be raw, sharp, and personal. Morrissey found their melancholy disingenuous, like a performance of despair instead of the real thing. And the irony is thick, because both he and Thom Yorke are seen as masters of misery. But for Morrissey, authenticity was everything, and he just didn't see it in Radiohead's polished gloom. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was pure artistic conflict, but whatever it was, it left no room for admiration. Then there was the feud that hit closest to home with fellow Manchester legends Oasis. Now, this one wasn't just personal, it was generational. Oasis, with their brash confidence, working-class swagger, and Beatles worship, was seen as the new face of British rock in the 90s, but Morrissey couldn't stand them. He once called them louts and dismissed their music as beer. Commercial rock. While the world was falling in love with Wonderwall, Morrissey was quietly seething. To him, Oasis weren't artists. They were laddish opportunists riding on nostalgia. He saw their success as a slap in the face to everything he'd worked for with the Smiths. He hated their arrogance, their shallow lyrics, their obsession with fame, and the Gallagher brothers, being who they are, didn't take kindly to that. Noel once fired back, saying Morrissey should lighten up and stop acting like the King of England. It was one of the few times someone met Morrissey's snark with equal force. What makes this rivalry fascinating is that both camps represented very different ideals of British identity. Morrissey was the tortured poet, the intellectual outsider. Oasis were the loud, proud everyman's band. They were fighting not just over music, but over what it meant to be British. And in a way, both sides had a point. So now, after all the insults, all the drama, all the shade thrown from stage to press conference, we're left with a strange truth. Morrissey's hate list tells us just as much about him as it does about the bands he attacked. Every feud reveals a part of his soul, what he values, what he loathes, and what he fears the industry is becoming. Love him or hate him, Morrissey never played by the rules. He built a career by turning pain into poetry, and he burned bridges with the same intensity he used to write lyrics. At 66, he's still the same firebrand he's always been, unfiltered, unforgiving, and undeniably fascinating. And maybe that's the point. In a world where everyone's trying to stay likable, Morrissey doesn't care if you like him at all. He just wants to tell the truth as he sees it, no matter who it offends. But where Madonna embraced controversy and thrived off fame like it was oxygen, Morrissey acted like he was somehow above it all, hovering in a higher moral space, gazing down at pop culture like a disappointed philosopher. The irony, though, was blinding. Because the more Morrissey criticized Madonna, the more press he generated. In some twisted way, talking trash about her got him more headlines than some of his own music did at the time. That's not an exaggeration. It was like he had found a cheat code to stay relevant. Just mention Madonna in the most brutal way possible and watch the media light up like fireworks. And perhaps the most savage thing he ever said about her was so cold, so devastating, it barely sounded like an opinion, it sounded like a nuclear strike. Morrissey once said that Madonna's music made him embarrassed to be human. Think about that for a second. That's not just a harsh review. That's not criticism. That is complete annihilation. He didn't say her songs were bad or shallow or uninspired. He said they made him ashamed of his own species. If there was ever a line that captured the volcanic disdain Morrissey was capable of, that was it. And the fact that he directed that level of hatred toward the most powerful woman in music at the height of her fame, it wasn't just shocking. It was legendary. Coming in at number 3 is The Cure. And if you thought Morrissey was brutal before, get ready, because this one is absolutely wild. You'd think Morrissey and Robert Smith would be best friends. They were both icons of melancholy. Both made music for the misfits and the brokenhearted, and both looked like they hadn't seen direct sunlight in years. They were basically two sides of the same black-clad, mascara-smudged coin. But apparently there wasn't room for two sad boys in British music. Morrissey didn't just dislike The Cure, he dismissed them as a parody of depression. Yes, a parody. He said Robert Smith wasn't authentic, that he was putting on an act with his smeared lipstick and haunted house haircut. Coming from Morrissey, the man who built an entire career on sadness that was a deep cut. But Robert Smith didn't roll over. He clapped back, hard. He called Morrissey pretentious, accused the Smiths of being boring, and even went so far as to say Morrissey's whole personality was fake, that he was just trying too hard to be interesting. It was like watching a dark comedy where the two main characters hate each other, but don't realize they're almost the same person. Fans were forced to pick sides. Were you Team Smiths or Team Cure? There was no middle ground. And music magazines were loving every second of it, milking the drama for every headline they could. What made this feud so intense was how personal it felt. They were both reaching for the same fans, the lonely teens, the disillusioned 20-somethings. Morrissey clearly felt like The Cure were stealing his thunder. He once accused Robert Smith of commercializing sadness and turning depression into a trend. And the funny thing? Decades later, both bands are now legends. Fans listen to both without blinking. But back then it was a war, and it was dead serious. Next on the list is Blur, and this feud wasn't just petty, it was generational. When Britpop exploded in the 1990s, Blur were leading the charge with cheeky, catchy tracks like Song 2 and Parklife. They were the new sound of Britain, confident and ironic and full of swagger. But Morrissey? He saw nothing but second-hand ideas. He absolutely destroyed Blur in interviews, calling them derivative, claiming they had no original thought, and suggesting that Damon Albarn was basically trying to become him, just without the talent or the brains. That's not just an insult, that's character assassination. One of his most savage quotes about Blur summed it up perfectly. He said they were, "What happens when mediocre people try to make important music?" That kind of statement doesn't leave room for debate, but Damon Albarn wasn't the type to quietly take a beating. He fired back, saying Morrissey was a bitter old man who couldn't accept that the world had moved on. Albarn called the Smiths overrated and suggested that their fans were just clinging to nostalgia. That was like declaring war on an entire generation. And here's the real twist. Blur had always acknowledged the Smiths as an influence. They said so publicly. But instead of seeing it as a compliment, Morrissey took it as theft. He once said that watching Blur succeed was like watching your own children grow up to disappoint you. Ouch. The media ran wild with this feud. Every time Morrissey made some snide comment about modern music, journalists would run to Blur for a response, and they never disappointed. The timing made it all even more explosive. This was Britpop's golden age. British music was having its biggest cultural moment since the 60s, but instead of unity, we got division. Morrissey viewed Blur not just as imitators, but as destroyers, people who were tearing down everything he believed the Smiths had built. The bitterness was real, and it only grew as Blur got bigger. And now we reach the crown jewel of Morrissey's musical hatred, Oasis. This feud wasn't just epic, it was legendary. Both Morrissey and Oasis hailed from Manchester, which made this feel less like a celebrity spat and more like a family feud that got completely out of control. At first, it seemed like there might be mutual respect.